The massive alien ship appeared over New York City at exactly noon on Tuesday, casting a shadow across Manhattan that made millions of people stop whatever they were doing and look up. The vessel was beautiful in a way that human engineering had never achieved, with flowing curves and surfaces that seemed to shift between silver and gold depending on the angle of sunlight. It hung there silently for 3 hours while the world held its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Nothing terrible happened. Instead, a voice spoke in perfect English from every television, radio, and internet device on the planet simultaneously. The voice was calm, measured, and somehow managed to sound both alien and reassuring at the same time. Ambassador Thane of the Rillan Empire introduced himself as a representative of the Galactic Council, a confederation of 12 advanced civilizations that had maintained peace across the galaxy for over 1,000 years. The message was simple and almost too good to be true. Humanity had reached a level of technological development that qualified them for membership in the galactic community. Earth would be welcomed as a protected member world, gaining access to technologies that would solve every major problem facing humanity. Disease would become a thing of the past, clean energy would be unlimited, and the stars themselves would be within reach. All that was required was Earth's agreement to join the Council's peaceful alliance. President Williams sat in the Oval Office 3 days later, surrounded by the world's top scientists, military leaders, and diplomats. The alien ambassador had materialized in the room using some form of matter transportation that defied every known law of physics. Thane looked remarkably human, though his skin had a slight blue tint and his eyes were larger than normal. He wore robes that seemed to be made of liquid starlight, and when he moved, the fabric rippled like water. The terms of membership were presented in a document that appeared to be written on some form of living paper. The words glowed softly and rearranged themselves into whatever language the reader was most comfortable with. Earth would contribute raw materials and agricultural products to the galactic economy. In return, humanity would receive medical technology that could extend life to over 200 years, fusion reactors that could power entire continents, and eventually, the secrets of faster-than-light travel. There was one small requirement that seemed entirely reasonable given the Council's generous offer. Earth's military forces would be disbanded as the Council maintained peace through diplomacy rather than warfare. Violence between sapient species had been eliminated from the galaxy centuries ago, and weapons of war were simply unnecessary in a civilized society. General Hayes spoke up from his position at the back of the room. He was a tall man with gray hair and scars from 3 different wars, and he had the look of someone who had seen too much of human nature to trust easily. He asked about Earth's right to defend itself, and Thane smiled with what appeared to be genuine warmth. The Council's fleet of advanced vessels would protect Earth from any possible threat, the ambassador explained. No hostile force in the galaxy could stand against their technology, and besides, there were no hostile forces left. The Council had either peacefully integrated every civilization they had encountered, or had been forced to pacify those few species that had chosen violence over cooperation. Dr. Torres, Earth's leading expert on quantum physics, asked technical questions about the alien technology. Her excitement was obvious as Thane described power sources that could tap directly into the quantum vacuum, computers that operated using principles that human science had only theorized about, and medical nanobots that could repair cellular damage at the genetic level. The possibilities were staggering. The vote was unanimous. Earth would join the Galactic Council as a protected member world. The first alien technologies arrived within a month. Fusion reactors that were no larger than shipping containers but could power entire cities. Medical equipment that could diagnose and treat diseases that had plagued humanity for millennia. Gravity manipulators that made space travel as simple as driving a car. The aliens were generous beyond belief, and humanity embraced their new friends with enthusiasm. General Hayes was not enthusiastic. Something about the entire situation felt wrong in a way that he could not articulate. The aliens were too generous, too willing to share their advanced technology with a species they had just met. In his experience, nobody gave away something valuable without expecting something more valuable in return. He began to pay attention to details that others were ignoring. The alien technology came with built-in restrictions that prevented humans from modifying or improving the devices. Every piece of equipment contained monitoring systems that reported back to the Council on how it was being used. Most concerning? The aliens seemed genuinely surprised by how quickly humans learned to operate their technology. Dr. Torres had noticed the same things. During her conversations with the alien technicians, she realized that most Council species had taken decades, or even centuries, to master technologies that humans were adapting to in a matter of weeks. The aliens kept commenting on humanity's unusual learning speed, as if it was something they had not expected. She began to suspect that the Council's offer was not quite as generous as it appeared. The restrictions built into their technology were too sophisticated and too comprehensive to be simple safety measures. They were designed to prevent humans from understanding how the devices actually worked, which suggested that the Council was worried about what might happen if humanity gained access to their scientific principles. General Hayes and Dr. Torres began meeting in secret, along with a small group of other scientists and military officers who shared their concerns. They called themselves the Prometheus Initiative, after the Greek myth of the Titan who stole fire from the gods to give to humanity. Their goal was simple: figure out how alien technology worked and learn to build it themselves. The work was dangerous and had to be done in complete secrecy. If the Council discovered what they were doing, the consequences could be catastrophic. But Hayes and Torres both understood that humanity's future might depend on their ability to stand on their own, rather than relying on the generosity of aliens who might not be as benevolent as they appeared. The first breakthrough came when Dr. Torres managed to reverse engineer a simple gravity manipulator. The device was far more elegant than anything human engineering had produced, but the basic principles were not beyond human understanding. More importantly, she discovered that human intuition and creativity allowed for improvements that the original designers had never considered. As the months passed, the Prometheus Initiative grew larger and more sophisticated. Hidden facilities were constructed beneath existing military bases, staffed by volunteers who understood that they were potentially committing treason against their own species. But they also understood that they might be humanity's only hope if the Council's true intentions were different from their stated goals. The masquerade continued. Earth played the role of grateful primitives, overwhelmed by the generosity of their advanced alien friends. But beneath the surface, humanity was learning, adapting, and preparing for a future that might be very different from the one the Council had promised. The transmission came through at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning, picked up by a monitoring station that officially did not exist. Captain Davis had been expecting something like this for months, but the reality was still worse than anything he had imagined. The communication was not intended for human ears, and it was only through a combination of luck and the quantum decryption software that Dr. Torres had developed that they were able to understand what they were hearing. The voices belonged to Council representatives discussing Earth's classification status. The conversation was casual, almost bored, as if they were discussing livestock rather than an entire sentient species. Earth had been designated as a Tier 9 harvesting world, which meant that the planet and its inhabitants were considered nothing more than resources to be exploited for the benefit of the galactic community. Davis listened to the recording 3 times before he fully understood what he was hearing. The Council's peace was not maintained through diplomacy and mutual respect. It was maintained through a system of technological oppression that kept emerging civilizations in permanent subjugation. Species that showed too much independence were classified as harvesting worlds, their populations managed like crops and their resources extracted for the benefit of their supposed protectors. The plan for humanity was sickeningly simple. Earth's population would be reduced from 7 billion to exactly 2 billion people over the next 50 years. The excess population would be relocated to industrial worlds throughout the galaxy, where they would serve as a labor force for Council mining operations, and manufacturing facilities. The remaining humans would be maintained on Earth as a genetic preserve, producing enough offspring to replace workers who died in the harsh conditions of the outer colonies. The system was elegant in its cruelty. By providing just enough technology to make resistance seem impossible, the Council ensured that their victims would never develop the capabilities needed to fight back. Species that accepted Council protection found themselves becoming increasingly dependent on alien technology until they could no longer survive without it. At that point, rebellion became literally impossible because it would result in the complete collapse of their civilization. Davis brought the recording to an emergency meeting of the Prometheus Initiative leadership. General Hayes listened to the alien voices with an expression that grew darker with each passing minute. Dr. Torres sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the table, but her knuckles were white with tension. President Williams, who had been brought into the secret group 6 months earlier, looked as if she might be sick. The discussion that followed was unlike anything in human history. They were talking about the survival of their entire species, and the decisions they made in the next few hours would determine whether humanity had a future or would simply become another entry in the Council's catalog of successfully managed civilizations. President Williams faced an impossible choice. She could reveal the truth to the world and watch as the Council's fleet of 200 warships reduced Earth to ash, or she could continue the charade while billions of humans were shipped off-world to die in alien labor camps. The Council had been very clear about the consequences of resistance. Species that refused to accept their proper place in the galactic order was simply eliminated. General Hayes presented a third option. The Prometheus Initiative had been successful beyond their wildest expectations. Hidden facilities on every continent were now producing hybrid human-alien technology that was superior to anything the Council had ever developed. More importantly, they had discovered something that the Council had completely missed about humanity. Dr. Torres stood up and activated a holographic display that showed the results of 5 years of secret research. Every other species in the galaxy had developed their technology slowly and methodically, following predictable patterns that took centuries or millennia to reach advanced levels. Humans were different. They possessed an unusual combination of creativity, adaptability, and intuitive understanding that allowed them to make breakthrough innovations in a matter of months or years. The Council's technology was advanced but stagnant. It had been developed using logical, methodical approaches that produced reliable results but little actual innovation. Human scientists had taken their devices and improved them in ways that the original designers never imagined. The gravity manipulators were now 30% more efficient. The fusion reactors produced twice as much power. The medical nanobots could perform functions that Council technology considered impossible, but the real breakthrough was in military applications. The Council's weapons were designed to be overwhelmingly powerful but not particularly sophisticated. They relied on brute force rather than tactical innovation, which made sense for a civilization that had not faced serious military opposition in over 1,000 years. Human weapons designers had taken a completely different approach, creating systems that were smaller, faster, and far more adaptable than anything in the Council's arsenal. The decision was made unanimously. Earth would continue to play the role of grateful primitives for a little longer, but they would use that time to prepare for a war that would determine the fate of not just humanity, but every species in the galaxy that had been enslaved by the Council's system of peaceful oppression. The next phase of the Prometheus Initiative began immediately. Production facilities that had been hidden beneath military bases were expanded into massive underground complexes. Shipyards were constructed in asteroid fields beyond the orbit of Pluto, invisible to Council sensors and capable of producing vessels that incorporated the best of human and alien technology. The first human volunteers were selected for off-world relocation, but these were not the helpless victims that the Council expected. They were carefully chosen special operations personnel who had been trained to establish resistance networks throughout the galaxy. Lieutenant Rivers, a former Navy Seal led the first group of 50 humans to a council mining world in the Vega system. Their mission was not to mine ore, but to make contact with other enslaved species and begin building a coalition of the oppressed. The council's representatives were pleased with Earth's compliance. The human volunteers had been properly grateful for the opportunity to contribute to the galactic community, and the shipments of raw materials were arriving on schedule. Ambassador Thane filed regular reports praising humanity's smooth integration into the council system. Earth was becoming a model for how primitive species should be managed. This confidence was exactly what the Prometheus Initiative was counting on. Every council representative who visited Earth returned with detailed intelligence about their military capabilities, political structure, and most importantly, their weaknesses. The aliens had become complacent after 1,000 years of unchallenged dominance, and they were revealing far more about themselves than they realized. Dr. Torres made the final breakthrough when she discovered that human neural patterns could interface directly with alien quantum computers. This was something that no other species had ever been able to accomplish, and it gave human commanders capabilities that the Council could not even imagine. Real-time tactical thinking at computational speeds meant that human military leaders could adapt to changing battle conditions faster than Council computers could process new information. The trap was set. The Council believed that they had successfully integrated another primitive species into their system of galactic oppression. What they had actually done was give humanity the motivation, the technology, and the time needed to build a military force capable of destroying them. The only question now was when to spring the trap. Deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, Commander Stone watched as the final assembly bay came online. The cavern was massive, carved out of solid granite using alien matter disintegrators that had been officially requisitioned for mining operations. The space was large enough to hold 3 city blocks, and it was filled with something that the Galactic Council's databases insisted should not exist. The human fleet was unlike anything that had ever been built. Each vessel was a fusion of alien technology and human innovation, incorporating design principles that the Council's engineers had never considered. Where alien ships were built for overwhelming power and intimidation, human vessels were designed for speed, adaptability, and tactical surprise. They were smaller than Council warships, but carried weapon systems that could punch through alien shields like paper. Stone had spent 3 years overseeing the construction process, working with teams of engineers who had been sworn to absolute secrecy. The ships were assembled using a modular approach that allowed for rapid reconfiguration depending on mission requirements. A vessel could be a long-range reconnaissance ship in the morning and a heavy assault cruiser by evening, simply by swapping out different equipment modules. The breakthrough had come when Dr. Torres discovered that human creativity could find ways to combine alien technologies that their original creators never imagined. Council science was advanced but rigid, following logical progressions that produced predictable results. Human engineers approached the same problems from completely different angles, creating solutions that were both elegant and completely unexpected. The quantum computers that powered Council ships were designed to process information using predetermined algorithms that had been refined over centuries. Human programmers had rewritten the basic operating systems to incorporate intuitive, decision-making processes that could adapt to new situations in real time. The result was AI systems that could think creatively rather than simply following programmed responses, but the real revolution was in the neural interface technology that Dr. Torres had developed. Human commanders could now link directly with their ship's computer systems, allowing them to process tactical information at superhuman speeds while maintaining the creativity and adaptability that made humans unique. It was like giving a chess grandmaster the ability to calculate 1,000,000 moves per second, while still thinking like a human. Lieutenant Rivers stood in the communication center of a mining facility on Kepler 186f, surrounded by representatives from 7 different species that had been enslaved by the Council over the past 5 centuries. The meeting had taken months to arrange, and even now, they were speaking in whispers to avoid detection by the monitoring systems that tracked every conversation on Council worlds. The Drakmari had been the first species to fall under Council control 300 years ago. They were natural engineers whose technology had been centuries ahead of anything else in their region of the galaxy. The Council had arrived offering protection from a fictitious alien threat, and by the time the Drakmari realized they had been deceived, it was too late to resist. Their population had been reduced from 12 billion to 3 billion, with the remainder serving as technical specialists throughout the Council Empire. The Villani were former warriors, whose military traditions went back thousands of years. They had fought against Council integration for 50 years, before finally being overwhelmed by superior numbers and technology. Now they served as security forces on Council worlds, keeping other enslaved species in line. But Rivers could see the hatred burning in their eyes. When they talked about their current situation, each species had a similar story. The Council would arrive offering protection or technological advancement, then gradually increase their control until resistance became impossible. The process was refined over centuries of practice, and it had never failed to completely subjugate the target civilization. Until now. Rivers explained the human plan to his audience, and for the first time in generations, the representatives of enslaved species began to hope. Humanity had not just resisted Council control. They had secretly built the capability to challenge Council supremacy throughout the galaxy. More importantly, they were willing to share their technology and tactical knowledge with anyone who wanted to fight for their freedom. The response was immediate and unanimous. Every species represented in that room agreed to begin preparing for a coordinated uprising that would strike Council worlds simultaneously. They had been waiting centuries for an opportunity like this, and they were not going to let it pass. Back on Earth, the final phase of preparation was entering its most critical stage. The human fleet was complete and ready for deployment, but it remained hidden in the outer system where Council sensors could not detect it. Admiral Peters, formerly a naval aviator who had commanded carrier groups in 3 different conflicts, was now responsible for coordinating humanity's first interstellar military operation. The target was carefully chosen. The Council's annual Harvest Festival was a celebration of their successful management of galactic civilization, with representatives from all 12 member species gathering at the capital station, above Nexus Prime. It was both a political summit and a cultural event, with the Council leadership showing off their most successful integration projects. This year, Earth had been invited to participate as an example of successful peaceful integration. Ambassador Martin, a career diplomat who had volunteered for what was essentially a suicide mission, would present humanity's gratitude for Council protection while simultaneously providing targeting data for the human fleet. The timing had to be perfect. Human forces throughout the galaxy would need to strike simultaneously before the Council could coordinate a response. The enslaved species had been quietly positioning themselves for months, preparing to sabotage critical infrastructure and capture strategic locations. But the success of the entire operation depended on the human fleet's ability to neutralize the Council's military forces before they could retaliate. Dr. Torres made the final adjustments to the neural interface systems that would give human commanders their decisive advantage. The technology was still experimental and potentially dangerous, but it was the only way to ensure that human tactics could adapt faster than Council computers could respond. She had volunteered to be the primary test subject, and the results were beyond anything they had hoped for. When linked to the ship's quantum computer, she could process tactical information at speeds that defied human comprehension while still maintaining the intuitive thinking that made humans unique among galactic species. It was like seeing the entire battlefield from every possible angle simultaneously, understanding not just what was happening, but what was likely to happen next based on patterns that no logical computer could predict. The final weapon in humanity's arsenal was something that the Council could never have anticipated. For 1,000 years, they had maintained control through superior technology and overwhelming force, but they had never faced an enemy that could innovate in real time, adapting their tactics and technology faster than established military doctrine could respond. Human military doctrine was based on chaos and unpredictability rather than logical progression, where council forces followed established battle plans that had been proven effective over centuries. Human commanders were trained to improvise and adapt based on immediate battlefield conditions. It was a completely different approach to warfare, and one that council military computers were not equipped to handle. The preparations were complete. Hidden throughout the galaxy, human operatives and their alien allies waited for the signal to begin humanity's first interstellar war. The Council's 1,000-year reign of peaceful oppression was about to end, and it would end not through negotiation or gradual reform, but through the complete military defeat of a system that had enslaved hundreds of billions of sentient beings. The masquerade was almost over. Soon, the galaxy would discover what happened when humans stopped playing the victim and revealed what they really were. The Great Assembly Hall of the Galactic Council was a monument to 1,000 years of peaceful oppression. Built from crystallized starlight and suspended in the void above Nexus Prime, it could hold representatives from every member species, while projecting their words and images to billions of viewers throughout the galaxy. Today, it was packed with dignitaries celebrating another successful year of galactic management. Ambassador Martin stood at the ceremonial podium, wearing the simple gray robes that marked him as a representative of Earth's grateful human population. Behind him, a holographic display showed images of human children playing in parks made possible by Council technology, human scientists working with alien equipment, and human workers preparing shipments of raw materials for export to distant worlds. The speech he was about to give had been carefully crafted to reinforce the Council's image of humanity as a model subject species. He would thank the Council for their protection, express gratitude for the technologies that had transformed human civilization, and humbly request continued guidance as Earth took its place in the galactic community. None of the assembled dignitaries suspected that every word of his presentation was being transmitted to human military commanders throughout the galaxy, providing real-time intelligence on Council fleet positions, defensive capabilities, and command structure. The seemingly innocent cultural presentation was actually the final briefing for Operation Prometheus, humanity's coordinated strike against every major Council installation in the galaxy. As Martin began his speech, Admiral Peters was floating in the command center of the flagship Phoenix, her consciousness linked to the ship's quantum computer through Dr. Torres's neural interface technology. The sensation was unlike anything she had ever experienced, like being able to think with the processing power of a star while maintaining the intuitive creativity that made humans unique. Around her, the human fleet waited in perfect silence. 200 vessels hung in the void beyond the edge of the Nexus system, invisible to Council sensors and ready to strike. Each ship was a masterpiece of hybrid technology, combining alien engineering with human innovation in ways that created capabilities far beyond what either species could achieve alone. The moment came when Martin reached the end of his prepared remarks. Instead of the humble request for continued guidance that the Council expected, he looked directly into the viewing sensors and spoke words that would echo throughout galactic history. He thanked the Council for teaching humanity an important lesson about the nature of power, and explained that humans had been excellent students. Then he smiled and added that class was now in session. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace, in perfect formation, appearing around every major Council world simultaneously. The attack was coordinated with precision that defied belief, with human forces materializing in the optimal position to engage each target while providing mutual support across vast distances. It was a tactical masterpiece that would have been impossible without the neural interface technology that allowed human commanders to think and react as a single, coordinated entity. The Council's response was immediate and predictable. Grand Admiral Corax, commanding the Council's most powerful fleet, issued orders for an immediate counterattack against Earth. The human homeworld would be reduced to molten slag as an example to any other species that might consider challenging Council authority. 200 Council warships, each one carrying enough firepower to destroy a planet, began the journey toward the Sol system. They never completed that journey. The human fleet that intercepted them was smaller in number but superior in every way that mattered. Where Council tactics relied on overwhelming firepower and established battle doctrine, human commanders adapted and improvised in real time. The neural interface technology allowed them to process tactical information at superhuman speeds while maintaining the creativity and unpredictability that made human warfare unique. The Battle of Sol lasted exactly 6 hours and 12 minutes. When it ended, the Council's grand fleet had been completely annihilated, with most of their vessels captured intact rather than destroyed. The engagement demonstrated that humans were not just capable of fighting the Council, they were capable of defeating them decisively using tactics and technology that Council military computers could not predict or counter. But the victory at Sol was only part of a much larger, coordinated assault. Throughout the galaxy, human-led resistance movements launched simultaneous attacks on Council installations, guided by tactical intelligence that had been gathered over 3 years of careful preparation. The enslaved species that had been oppressed for centuries rose up as one. Equipped with weapons that human innovation had made devastatingly effective, Lieutenant Rivers coordinated the attack on the mining facility, where he had been stationed for 2 years. The Drakmari and Villani workers who had been building a secret resistance network struck with precision that caught the Council security forces completely off guard. The facility's defenses were designed to prevent escape attempts, not to resist. A coordinated military assault by people who understood the layout better than their guards. The pattern was repeated on hundreds of worlds throughout the galaxy. Species that had been classified as helpless victims revealed that they had been preparing for this moment for months, building weapons and training resistance fighters using knowledge provided by human military advisors. The Council's system of oppression collapsed not because of superior firepower, but because it was based on the assumption that enslaved populations would never be able to coordinate effective resistance. The Council's leadership tried desperately to maintain control. As reports of defeats came in from across the galaxy, they had never faced a coordinated uprising on this scale, and their military doctrine was not designed to handle simultaneous rebellions on hundreds of worlds. More importantly, they had never encountered an enemy that could adapt their tactics faster than Council computers could process new information. Grand Admiral Corex, now commanding the Council's reserve fleet from a heavily defended station in the Rigel system, attempted to rally the remaining loyal forces for a final counterattack. The plan was simple but brutal. Every world that had joined the human-led rebellion would be sterilized from orbit, serving as an example to any other species that might consider resistance. The attack never came. The human fleet that appeared in the Rigel system was led by Admiral Peters herself, commanding a task force of 50 vessels that had been upgraded with technology captured from the defeated Council ships. The engagement lasted less than an hour, ending when Corex's flagship was boarded by human marines who had been trained to fight in zero gravity, using weapons that could cut through alien armor like tissue paper. The surrender came 12 hours later. The surviving Council leadership, trapped in their capital station with no military forces left to protect them, agreed to unconditional surrender rather than face the alternative of complete extinction. The Galactic Council's 1,000-year reign of peaceful oppression had ended not with negotiation or gradual reform, but with total military defeat by a species they had dismissed as primitive victims. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Council military forces throughout the galaxy surrendered or were destroyed by human-led coalitions. The enslaved species that had been oppressed for centuries suddenly found themselves free to determine their own futures. The galactic economy, which had been based on exploitation and forced labor, collapsed overnight as entire species refused to continue serving their former masters. Ambassador Martin, who had somehow survived the chaos at the Council capital, found himself in the unprecedented position of accepting the surrender of a galactic empire. The formal ceremony was held in the same great assembly hall where he had delivered his speech, but now the roles were reversed. The Council representatives who had once celebrated their successful management of galactic civilization were now prisoners. awaiting trial for crimes against sentient species. The victory was complete, but it was only the beginning. Humanity had proven that the Council's system of oppression could be defeated, but now they faced the much more difficult task of building something better to replace it. The galaxy was free, but freedom without order was just another form of chaos. The real test of human leadership would come in the months and years ahead, as they tried to create a galactic civilization based on mutual respect rather than domination. The former Council prison facility on Titan Station had been converted into a courthouse, though the irony was not lost on anyone involved. The same cells that had once held political prisoners from dozens of species now housed the Council leadership, who had ordered their imprisonment. The trials had been proceeding for 6 months, with testimony from survivors of the Council's system of oppression painting a picture of systematic exploitation that spanned centuries. General Hayes walked through the corridors of the station, observing the proceedings with mixed emotions. The military victory had been complete and decisive, but winning the war had turned out to be far simpler than managing the peace. The galaxy was free from Council oppression, but freedom without structure was proving to be its own form of chaos. The challenges were unprecedented. Hundreds of species that had been enslaved for generations suddenly found themselves free to determine their own futures, but many lacked the experience or resources to build stable governments. The galactic economy had collapsed when the forced labor system ended, leaving billions of beings without work or purpose. Most critically, several former Council species were attempting to rebuild their own empires. Having learned nothing from their defeat, Dr. Torres had been working around the clock to establish the technological foundation for a new galactic order. The decision had been made to freely share human innovations with any species that wanted them, but the implementation was proving more complex than anticipated. Some civilizations were afraid that accepting human technology would simply replace Council domination with human control. Others were so dependent on Council systems that they could not survive without continued technological support. The solution was uniquely human in its approach. Instead of creating a new centralized authority to replace the Council, humanity had proposed a network of independent systems connected by mutual defense agreements. Each species would maintain complete sovereignty over their own worlds and internal affairs, but would be bound by treaty to assist any member that faced external aggression. The Galactic Defense Alliance, as it came to be known, was based on principles that would have been impossible under the Council system. No member species could be forced to participate in military action against their will, but any species that attacked an alliance member would face the combined military might of all participating civilizations. It was a system that encouraged cooperation while preventing the kind of domination that had made the Council's oppression possible. The former Council species reacted to their new situation in predictable ways. The Rillans, who had served as the Council's primary military force, initially attempted to re-establish control over their former territories. They discovered that human tactical doctrine had spread throughout the galaxy, and their victims were no longer helpless prey. The Rillan fleet that attempted to retake the Vega system was destroyed by a coalition of former slave species using weapons and tactics provided by human military advisors. Captain Davis, now serving as Earth's primary liaison with the Alliance, military command, found herself dealing with situations that no human had ever faced before. The coordination required to manage defense agreements between dozens of species with different technologies, cultures, and military traditions was staggering. But the neural interface technology that had given humans their decisive advantage in the war was proving equally valuable in managing the complex logistics of galactic defense. The most difficult challenge was dealing with species that had been so thoroughly broken by centuries of oppression that they could not function as independent civilizations. The Xanthari had been enslaved for over 400 years, with their entire culture reduced to serving the Council's administrative needs. When freedom came, they literally did not know how to govern themselves or make decisions without Council oversight. Lieutenant Rivers, now promoted to colonel and serving as Earth's chief advisor on liberated worlds, had been working with Centauri leaders for months to help them rebuild their civilization. The process was slow and often frustrating, but it was necessary. True freedom meant giving every species the opportunity to determine their own future. Even if that future looked nothing like what humans would choose, the war crimes trials were reaching their conclusion, with most of the council leadership facing sentences that would effectively end their natural lives. The evidence against them was overwhelming, documented in their own records and confirmed by testimony from thousands of survivors. But the trials had also revealed uncomfortable truths about the nature of oppression and the responsibility of those who enabled it. Ambassador Thane, the same Rilung who had first contacted Earth with the Council's offer of protection, sat in his cell awaiting final sentencing. He had been found guilty of crimes against sentient species, but his testimony had provided valuable insight into how the Council system had operated. More importantly, it had revealed the mindset that had made their oppression possible. Captain Davis visited him one final time before the sentencing, partly out of curiosity and partly because she needed to understand how an entire civilization could have convinced itself that enslaving other species was not just acceptable, but morally justified. The conversation that followed would stay with her. For the rest of her life, Thane expressed genuine confusion at humanity's actions throughout the conflict. The Council had offered Earth the same arrangement. They had successfully negotiated with hundreds of other species over the centuries. Most had accepted the offer gratefully, recognizing that cooperation with a superior force was preferable to extinction. Why had humans chosen to fight an unwinnable war instead of accepting the benefits of Council membership? Davis considered the question carefully before responding. The Council had made one critical error in their calculations, she explained. They had assumed that survival was humanity's highest priority, which would have been a reasonable assumption for most species. But humans were different in a fundamental way that the Council had never encountered before. For humans, some things were worth dying for. Freedom was one of those things. The right to determine their own future, even if that future included the possibility of failure, was more important than the security of guaranteed survival under alien rule. Once the Council understood that humans would rather die than accept slavery, they should have realized that those same humans would be willing to kill to prevent it. The conversation ended with Davis explaining humanity's ultimate achievement. They had not just won a war against superior technology and overwhelming numbers. They had changed the fundamental nature of galactic civilization from one based on submission to one based on mutual respect. The galaxy was free, and it would remain free because Earth had proven that even the most advanced tyranny could be defeated by those who refused to accept that freedom was negotiable. The final phase of reconstruction began with the establishment of the new Galactic Charter, a document that enshrined the principles of self-determination and mutual cooperation that would govern relations between species. Unlike the Council's system of centralized control, the Charter was designed to prevent any single species or group from achieving the kind of dominance that had made oppression possible. The signing ceremony was held on Earth, in the same United Nations building where humanity had first debated whether to accept the Council's offer of protection. Representatives from 47 species gathered to sign a document that would fundamentally reshape galactic civilization. The Charter established principles that seemed simple but were revolutionary in their implications. No species could be forced to accept foreign rule. Number civilization could be prevented from developing their own technology, and any attempt to establish dominance over another species would be met with the combined resistance of the entire alliance. The years that followed were not without challenges. Several former Council species attempted to rebuild their empires, only to discover that the galaxy had changed in ways they could not understand. The Corvani Empire tried to reclaim their former colonies in the Centaurus sector, but found themselves facing a coalition of freed worlds that fought with human tactics and human-designed weapons. The war lasted 3 months and ended with the complete destruction of the Corvani fleet. More importantly, the freed species had learned the lesson that humanity had taught them. Freedom was not something that could be given by others. It had to be earned and defended by those who wanted it. The galaxy was no longer divided between masters and slaves, but between those who believed in freedom and those who still dreamed of dominion. Dr. Torres spent her remaining years working to ensure that the technological advantages that had made human victory possible would never again be concentrated in the hands of a single species. The neural interface technology, the quantum computers, and the advanced weapon systems were all shared freely with any civilization that wanted them. But more importantly, she established research institutes throughout the galaxy where different species could work together to develop new technologies that no single civilization could have created alone. The result was an explosion of innovation that surpassed anything the galaxy had seen during the Council's reign. When different approaches to problem-solving were combined, the results were often revolutionary. Human creativity merged with Drakmari engineering precision, Villani warrior instincts combined with Xanthari administrative efficiency, and dozens of other partnerships produced technologies that were far superior to anything that had existed before. General Hayes lived to see the first generation of children born into the new galactic order reach adulthood. They grew up in a universe where freedom was considered a natural right rather than a privilege granted by superior beings. They learned from teachers of a dozen different species, played games that combined human imagination with alien logic, and dreamed dreams that spanned star systems rather than single worlds. The transformation was not limited to technology and politics. The cultural exchange that followed the establishment of the Alliance created new forms of art, music, and literature that reflected the experiences of beings from across the galaxy. Human jazz merged with Rillan harmonic mathematics to create music that could only be described as transcendent. Villani warrior poetry combined with human storytelling traditions produced epic narratives that captured the struggles and triumphs of the Liberation War. But perhaps the most important change was philosophical. The council system had been based on the assumption that some species were naturally superior to others, and that civilization required hierarchy and control. The Alliance was founded on the radical idea that intelligence and creativity were not the exclusive property of any single species, and that the greatest achievements came from cooperation rather than domination. The final test of the new order came 30 years after the Council's defeat, when long-range sensors detected an approaching fleet from outside the galaxy. The vessels were larger and more advanced than anything in Alliance databases, and their intentions were unknown. For the first time since the Liberation War, the galaxy faced a potential threat that could unite or destroy them. The response was swift and decisive. Within hours of the detection, Alliance fleets from across the galaxy were converging on the approach vector. But this was not the panicked mobilization of a threatened civilization. It was the calm, professional response of beings who had learned that freedom was worth defending and who possessed the means to do so effectively. Captain Davis, now an admiral and commander of the Alliance's Rapid Response Fleet, led the initial contact mission. The alien vessels were indeed more advanced than anything the Alliance had encountered, but they were not invaders. They were refugees from another galaxy that had been consumed by a conflict not unlike the one that had ended the Council's reign. The negotiations that followed resulted in the first expansion of the Alliance beyond the boundaries of the Milky Way. The refugee fleet brought new technologies and new perspectives, but more importantly, they brought confirmation that the principles the Alliance was founded on were not limited to any single galaxy or group of species. The story ended where it had begun, with humanity making contact with advanced alien civilizations. But this time, the contact was between equals rather than masters and subjects. The galaxy had learned the lesson that Earth had taught through 3 years of careful deception and 6 hours of devastating warfare. True civilization was not built on the submission of the weak to the strong, but on the recognition that strength came from unity and that freedom was not negotiable. In the end, humanity's greatest achievement was not the technology they had developed or the wars they had won. It was the simple but revolutionary idea that every sentient being had the right to determine their own future, and that this right was worth defending against any force that threatened it. The galaxy was free, and it would remain free, because humanity had taught them that some things were worth dying for, and therefore worth living for.